think the tax rates ought to go up was, again, a basis of the prosecution. The government prosecuted successfully thousands of people who expressed opposition to the war. So this is 1915, 1916, 1917. We're not talking ancient history. Lots of people went to jail for something that today we believe is part and parcel of the fundamental rights that we have. So what was happening in the States? That's the story about the federal government. Well, what was happening in the States is equally depressing. People were trying to use the streets for various demonstrations, but around the country, when people sought to do that, they were prosecuted or prevented. So the case of Emma Goldman in Philadelphia is a good example. So Emma Goldman was a leading radical of her time. She was an anarchist. She traveled around. She was a woman clearly ahead of her time. She traveled around independently, giving speeches. That's how she survived, by her speeches. She had booked a hall in Philadelphia to give a talk. Of course, the city wasn't pleased at all that she was coming to town, and immediately took actions to try to block her. Among other things, the director of public safety demanded to see her speech in advance. You know, we want to see what you're going to say. She'd already rented the hall. She was prevented from going into the hall to give the speech. She went into court. This is classic Emma Goldman. She lawyered up, so to speak, and sued the city in an effort to get an injunction to prevent them from blocking her from giving the speech, but she was unsuccessful. The court basically said the city has a legitimate basis to keep this radical from taking, standing at the podium and giving her speech. They were fearful of how people would react to her speech. But this was not confined simply to Pennsylvania. All over the country, people were being successfully prosecuted when they expressed an opinion that wasn't the majority opinion. So, as an example, Upton Sinclair. Most of you know about Upton Sinclair. Not only was he a muckraker, talented author, he was a person that was quite prepared to take to the streets and protest. Standard Oil was the owner of a mine in Colorado. There had been the suppression of the strike, and lives had been lost in Colorado. So Upton Sinclair and others stood outside Standard Oil in New York City to protest Standard Oil's involvement in that disorder. Upton Sinclair and others were arrested. The court, in upholding that conviction, said this: if conduct is likely to be resented, the behavior is unlawful, even if the demonstration is conducted in a peaceful and courteous manner. So, in Massachusetts, as an example, people wanted to carry a red flag in a parade, and they were prevented from doing that. Why? The court said a red flag was a revolutionary emblem and therefore likely to produce turbulence if, in fact, it was carried in a parade. So, don't carry the flag. If you do, we'll arrest you. Oliver Wendell Holmes, before he became a justice on the United States Supreme Court, was on the High Court in Massachusetts. He had a case before him in which the issue was, could people use the Boston Commons to demonstrate? And he adopted a view that was common in the states at that time, and that is, Boston, like any private owner, think Walmart or Target or whatever, like any private owner, could make decisions about who used the property, who used that public property. Pretty amazing. And that view was the dominant view in the States. So I think the point I'm trying to make here is that when we talk to our friends and neighbors, and sometimes when we are particularly good about our status as U.S. citizens, we say what about free speech? We say that we've enjoyed the right to engage in free speech since the beginning of the country. And of course, not only its history, but law points in the other direction. Our protection for free speech is really the result largely of the last 50 to 60 years of Supreme Court decisions. And so what changed? I think ultimately many of the fears about the consequences of speech the court came to recognize were overstated. The driving concern is, as you see in these early cases, was the fear that there would be disorder or turmoil as a result of people expressing their views. And so courts were part of the establishment, and the view of the establishment was that we need to maintain order at all costs. And too bad, so sad, people don't have the right to express themselves. That's just a natural consequence of maintaining order. So what happened after 1925, and the court now has taken the view that the amendment has, the First Amendment protection with regard to speech applies equally to the restrictions that are imposed on speech by either the federal government or the states. Well, the court took more cases, and so we started getting more decisions from the Supreme Court on the issue of free speech. In 1939, a case came to the court in which the mayor of Jersey City took the view that had been expressed some 35 years earlier in the case that I referred to, the decision written by Oliver Wendell Holmes. The mayor of Jersey City said, in response to labor picketers who wanted to take to the streets, you can't use the streets, we own the streets, and we haven't given you permission to use them, and by God, we're not going to give you permission to use them. That case eventually got to the Supreme Court. The court doesn't, in this case, render a decision, but it says something pretty important. It rejects the idea that city streets are like private property. And here's what the court says. Wherever the title of streets and parks may rest, they immemorially have been held in trust for the use of the public. And time out of mind have been used for purposes of assembly, communicating, and discussing public questions. Of course, history doesn't support time out of mind. But nonetheless, this is an important state dicta. It's not a ruling in this case. But nonetheless, an important state that public sidewalks, public streets, public parks are not the same as private property. And government's relationship to those that property is not the same as a private owner has to his or her property. In 1941, because people now were using the streets and sidewalks more frequently, the Supreme Court ruled that streets and sidewalks, in fact, could be conditioned, their use could be conditioned by the use of permits. This is the first time in the law in which the court approves a permitting system. And that today is a standard feature of the law governing demonstrations, any place really involving at least places like parks, or in some cases even places like Capitol ground. So what is this permitting process about? The court said that a permitting process, even though it requires people to get prior approval in order to demonstrate, the court said it is permissible and not a violation of the First Amendment if, in fact, every speaker is treated equally without regard to what they want to say. And so one way of thinking about a permit system, we have one in Harrisburg, we want to have a demonstration, you're going to have to go to City Hall and get a permit, is to think about it as the deli counter, where you expect to be treated once your number comes up like everybody else. You want something in that cooler, and somebody else wants somebody else. The clerk behind that cooler is supposed to fill your order. So too, that's the idea behind a permit. So the permit is supposed to be content neutral. The permit administrator is not supposed to be making decisions on the fact that we don't like your speech, but we're in favor of yours, so you get the permit, but you don't. If you can establish that, this goes all the way back to if you can establish that, then yes, you can complain, legitimately complain, and the courts are open to that kind of challenge, that permit administrators cannot pick and choose among speakers.